Entering the village, I had seen little of interest. As in most villages, everything was hidden behind high, blank courtyard walls. There were no squares, gardens, or restaurants. The only public place was the mosque, and in Sunni areas villagers wouldn't let me enter a mosque. Now, as I walked in the dusk, I noticed how the mud varied from coarse, dove-grey bricks to pink, waxy plaster on the walls, the path and the canal banks. Towers and domes were silhouetted against the darkening, cloud-troubled sky. One of the thick walls of an old fort had crumbled inwards, revealing an overgrown rose garden in the courtyard, sunk 12 feet below the level of the street and fed by a slender waterfall. I could see a mulberry tree through a half-open gate. Firelight played around the thick frame of a high window. The deep courtyards and the old arches and windows that rose just a foot above the street had been parts of substantial houses built long before, now folded into the foundations of the village. This is an extract from a book I've recently finished reading called The Places in Between by Rory Stewart, documenting his journey through Afghanistan's mountains shortly after the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001. What I love about this passage is the way Stewart tells a story by simply describing the environment around him. This is a recurring theme throughout the book. Rather than having all the story take place exclusively in dialogue, as is common and safe, Stewart spends a considerable amount of time using the environment to express the conditions and circumstances around him, as well as using them effectively to set the tone of his book that is exploring the ancient and modern stories of Afghanistan. Environmental storytelling is very common in visual or interactive arts. In video games, it can be the opening up of an apparent boss fight arena in Dark Souls, or the finding of corpses in the caves beneath the castle in Tomb Raider. This allows the developers to expand their world, add intrigue and mystery, as well as tell a secondary narrative without being explicit or blunt. GameDeveloper.com described this as more collaborative than performative. A game's content developer will select objects for a location, arrange those objects in some way that feels meaningful, and then leave the final interpretation of the tableau to the player. The beauty of this form of storytelling is that it allows players to feel more immersed in the world, to infer meaning from their surrounding but without distracting them from the central aim or the story motivation. It all contributes to helping the world feel more alive and immersive, and thus aids in creating a realistic and interesting world. Bethesda is famous for using environmental storytelling to set a tone, atmosphere, give clues, or to reference popular culture. These are effective because their meaning is inferred and adds depth to the world. When we find a bed with two skeletons holding hand, we can let our minds do the work without it being explicit. Environmental storytelling is also persistent in the best films and TV shows, in the same way as video games, using the environment, objects within it, the weather, music and tone to communicate with the audience can be very effective. The best horror films do this expertly to build a sense of dread and anticipation. Using the backgrounds, sounds, and sights to your advantage is a great way to set a scene and develop a theme or wider narrative that never needs to be explicitly mentioned. Shutter Island's use of weather, atmospherics, and environmental clues is part of what makes the narrative so compelling. It wouldn't have been the same film if it had set on a sunny beach in the Caribbean. Topos magazine explained in 2019 why environmental storytelling made Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men so compelling. Unlike most dystopian films, however, Cuarón dispenses with the need for a lengthy written prologue, bringing the audience up to speed. Instead, the world is revealed to us in countless background visuals, the news reporting the death of the youngest person in the world, a newspaper papered it to the inside of the van reporting a nuclear bomb in Kazakhstan, scenes of immigrants locked up in cages, and the bizarre hoarding of various priceless artworks inside Battersea Power Station. We might have to watch twice or 3 times to get it all, but from the very beginning of the film, the environment is there telling us that something is not right. So let's return to the places in between, because after all, this is a channel primarily about books, not films or TV shows. What Stewart does throughout the story is to use the actions of people, the state of the architecture, the well-being of the animals, and the atmosphere of post-invasion Afghanistan to paint a compelling and intriguing backdrop. The focus of the story is primarily his walk across the mountains of Gore, but Stewart dedicates a lot of time to setting the scene, so that we really feel that we're with him in the moment. There are wonderful environmental details that express matter-of-factly throughout that really lend to the depth of the story. Stewart talks about how people he meets care for their horses more than their family based on how they dress. He describes how the locals have ransacked the Turquoise Mountain, but rather than openly condemning it, he simply uses the environment and lets the reader make the judgment. After tea, I climbed up the hill beside the tower. The gravel was loose and the slopes steep, and I needed to use my hands. I soon found myself clambering over rough trenches, some almost 10 feet deep. Along the rim of the pits were piles of sand and pottery fragments. I passed shards of brilliant yellow porcelain, half a terracotta bowl, a section of ancient guttering, and some new spades and pickaxes. Clearly the antique robbers did not steal one another's tools. Those digging had made no attempt to preserve the shape of the buildings they had found. Only a tiny section of the ridge could you even trace the walls of the rooms. The villagers were tunneling as deep and as quickly as possible to reach whatever lay beneath, and destroying a great deal in the process. The trenches, invisible from the base of the tower, now stretched across every slope in sight. The villagers had clearly succeeded where the archaeologists had failed, and had uncovered an ancient city. What makes this type of storytelling so effective is that it isn't used carelessly. Only when Stewart wants to draw attention to detail or needs to add context before a conversation. This allows these elements to fit seamlessly into the story from an objective point of view, giving the reader a sense of location and understanding before more subjective elements are added in conversation. This helps Stewart establish himself as a reliable narrator, and massively adds to reader immersion. What really makes this work is that things are described well and appropriately. There is no exaggeration or over-emotive language being used. Rather, short or medium-length sentences detail things that are visible or audible in a punchy and stative way. When talking about the environment, you should endeavour to do the same. Keep things simple and frank, or you risk over-embellishing and therefore boring or lecturing your reader. One paragraph and describe an entire scene, and it shouldn't be much more than that. So just remember that the environment is part of your story. Don't forget about it. While we should endeavour to show rather than tell, it can be very hard, if not impossible, to show every important detail to our reader in a book. Sometimes a little telling can go a long way to create an environment that aids your story. Including the environment well can create compelling and intriguing atmospheres that really hook your reader, and allow them to invest so much more in the characters who are journeying through them.